to the Convinced God Moves podcast, where stories of struggle are met with hope. My name is Audra, and I'm capturing stories from people sitting right in front of me, digging up hard stuff from their lives. Today, Sue is going to share about a tragic accident that happened to her son when he was a toddler and the many years of battles that followed. She'll describe miracle after miracle that came along the way, despite her son never receiving the healing they prayed for. After listening to this, if you think, I want to hear more from Sue, you can find a link in the show notes attached to this episode. No doubt you will enjoy listening to her as she shares her rock-solid faith that God can do the impossible. It's fun imagining who might be encouraged by Sue's story. Perhaps people who've gone through life-altering accidents. Perhaps parents who are overwhelmed taking care of their kids. I assume anyone in the middle of grief will relate to some of her words. May God use each chiseled piece of this grieving mom's story. Sue, I've known you for just a couple years from getting to go to conferences and hear you speak, and I just so appreciate you being willing to come share your story about your son, Luke.
Yeah, well, thank you for asking me to share my story. I want his memory to stay alive for a long time. So it's a blessing and an honor to be asked to share the story.
All right, so let's begin with when Luke was born. What year was that?
Yeah, Luke was born March 10th, 2003. Yeah, he was born a healthy boy, running and laughing and talking and everything. And then on August 30th of 2004, he got out of a gate and ended up in our backyard pool. And my daughter, Amy, found him dead in the bottom of our pool. And at that time, she was only 15 years old. And my son, Daniel, did CPR on him, but he was gone. And I was screaming, and the neighbor heard us. And I know it was God. We called him Angel Jim for a while. He just happened to be visiting his daughter 2 houses down, heard the screaming and ran. And he was a paramedic, so he started CPR. Still nothing. And I called 911. They came and picked him up, and there was police there and firemen, and they took him, and he was gone. I remember laying on the front yard looking at a policeman saying, "Do you believe in God? Because I believe in God, and I believe that just like he raised Lazarus from the death, he can raise my son from the dead." And this policeman looked at me with just, "Oh, I'm sorry for you, lady. I feel sorry for you." And just, your son's dead. He's gone. And within a minute, we got a call from the hospital. He was already at the hospital saying, "Come." And we didn't even know where he took him. I was just... When you go through an experience like that, you're incapacitated. So I jumped into a car a friend drove. We drove to Mary Bridge Hospital, and he was alive. And the amazing part about that is he had been dead for over 40 minutes, and they were getting ready to write down the time of death. They tried everything. They tried the paddles. They tried every resuscitation. Later, I had a nurse come to me, and she's like, "Every time I think about your son, I get goosebumps because I was in that room and nobody was touching him, and he came back to life." And so that was our first miracle, one of many miracles, many, many miracles along the way. So he was 17 months old when that happened. And I remember that very first night in the hospital, them saying, "Just don't get your hopes up. This is bad," and I kept saying, "No, this is nothing. God can do all things," And I'm just going to back up for a second and say probably that first couple hours, I could only speak in tongues because you see, the Holy Ghost, he's our comforter. And that was the only thing that could comfort me during that time of pure hell. So finally, the doctor finally came in and was not positive and didn't think he was going to live. And that night, though, they would make little comments like, well, that's a good sign. Well, that's a good sign. And within a day or so, they were like, if we're going to continue on with this, we need to think about, because he wasn't waking up. Even though he was alive, he had had anoxic brain injury. And so I will condense this to say that the doctors said, you need to make a choice. And so we had a prayer meeting in his room, and we cried out to God, my husband and I don't even remember who else there, a few family members. And we said, Lord, what do we do? Do we let him live, or do we just unplug him and give you the choice of taking him? We just felt in our hearts he was to live and not die. The PICU doctor at that time said if it was my child, I would unplug him, because you guys are going to have heartache if you let him live. But we chose that road, and immediately then it was like, okay, he's going to need a trach, he's going to need a feeding tube, it's just like, and in my mind, I kept thinking, no, God, he's going to get up, he's going to walk. I had so much faith to believe that he was going to be made whole, and God had a different plan. Luke was left the hospital a month later in a vegetative ketonic stage where all he did was stare. He didn't have any emotions. He didn't cry. All he did was stare. He was that way for probably almost a year. We tried so many therapies, hundreds of hyperbaric chamber dives and cranial sacral. And I mean, you name it. We tried therapies and just this and that, and just things that we had read for people, so many people want to give you advice when you have that kind of situation. And it was interesting because it was shortly after a hyperbaric chamber dive, and we went to a Ralpher, which is a deep tissue massage therapist, and he made the first noise and he cried. And it was like the first time we'd heard him cry in like a year. And I was just like, he's never done this, So, and then it was shortly after that, our family went on a long vacation. And, the thing about Luke was we have 7 children. He wasn't our only one. And I wanted life to be as normal as it possibly could. So we still would go on vacations. We took him camping. We took him on trips across America. He smiled for the first time on a trip. We had taken a trip, and we have a picture of him, and we were in a hotel room right across the street from Six Flags in California. And he smiled for the first time. And Luke, after that, he smiled, he cried. He had emotions. He never said another word.
So let me stop you there.
Yeah.
How old was he when he had that first smile on family vacation?
It was probably about a year after the accident. So he was probably about
2.5,
close to 3 years old.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
And where is he as far as order of kids? Is he one of the youngest?
He is. He was number 6.
Okay.
And I was pregnant with Lily, our 7th, when that happened. So I was 4 months pregnant when that accident happened. So that was a lot of challenge right there, too, because then I had a baby months after his accident. And so I had 2 babies all the time. It was like having twins, basically. I'd rock them both at night, and, and so. And the thing about Luke, then he ended up being 24/7 care. We had to have nurses. We couldn't leave the hospital without nurses because he had a trach. And tracheostomy is a tube that goes into your trach, in your throat. And you have to have special training on how to clean it and how to suction. And so we had that for a while, but I fought to get that out. and he did. He ended up getting rid of it at 9 months. And that same PICU doctor that told us to let him die was the same PICU doctor that was watching us the night he got his trach out. And even though that man professed to be a Christian, he was extremely negative. And he said to my husband, and I'm glad I wasn't in the room when he said it, he said, I'll see you tonight in the PICU. After he got his trach out.
You'll be back.
We'll be back. But praise God, we weren't. And he lived the rest of his life without a trach, which was a miracle in itself, because there was a couple doctors at a couple times that it's like, well, maybe we should put it back in, but a person with a trach is a whole nother level of care that is just hard.
And you can't learn that as a parent.
We did learn. We learned how to do trach care. 4 of us in our family learned it. My husband and I, my sister Cindy, and Amy, my daughter Amy. So we had 4 people that could do trach care. So if we needed to go somewhere, Amy could watch him, or Cindy could watch him when we didn't have nurses. So yeah.
That's at 24/7. Because a
24/7.
trait can't not be monitored.
Yeah. So he was on machines pretty much for the rest of his life, like 24/7. There was rare nights that we ever had a full night's sleep, my husband and I. And I would usually cover the first half of the night, and then I would wake him up early in the morning and say, okay, now it's your turn, And we had nurses for a while at night, but we realized that they are a blessing to have, and yet it's hard to have somebody in your home 24/7. It's just they're not a part of the family,
Yeah.
And so that's a whole nother layer of hard. There's just a lot of layers of hard. So, and we began what was called How's Luke Doing? .blog. And we kept that going for probably 13 or 14 years. And we would give updates because we had people all over the world, and literally all over the world, praying for Luke. Just, how a prayer chain goes. This person knows that person. And then all of a sudden you've got people in England and Africa. And,
You got to pray for this kid. You got to pray for this kid.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it just grows, you know. And hallelujah for those prayer warriors. I often say, if it hadn't been for them, I don't think I could have survived it, because there were so many impossible, hard days and nights. So, but God is gracious, and he gives us the strength. And I can't tell you how many times I would wake up in the morning exhausted, 3, maybe 2 hours of sleep. And I'd say, Lord, I need your supernatural strength and power today. And he kept me going. Streams in the Desert was given to me shortly after Luke's accident. And I would literally have Post-it notes all over my bathroom window. And it's just a bunch of scriptures of just faith-filled scriptures, nothing is impossible for God. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. When we are weak, he makes us strong. And I can't even think of all of them. But I would say it's specific verses that just ministered to me and just brought me hope and life. So there's so many little stories I could share about just God's faithfulness. One of them is, Luke, it's expensive to have a child like that. And when you're a middle class, we're not poor. We're not super rich.
Yeah.
We're middle class. We couldn't qualify for any assistance. We couldn't qualify for hospital assistance. We couldn't qualify for any kind of assistance. And we couldn't even get state assistance, nothing. And I'll never forget, one night was just a horrible night, just up all night with alarms. We were still getting used to it. And I was just having a pity party for myself. And I was just crying. I'm like, God, I can't do this. I can't do this. And that day I just thought, I'm going to get myself up and go out to the mailbox. And that day we had a check in the mail for $20,000. And it was a relative who said, we know how expensive this journey is. And God is so faithful, because we never had a bill we couldn't pay. We never went into debt.
Wow.
God was faithful. And to the fact that there were therapies we wanted to try, like hyperbaric treatments. And I do believe those helped. When we first started hyperbaric, he had no tracking of his eyes. And within a couple months, he could track with it. I mean, that means his eyes would follow things. For a while, they just stared all the time, So God is faithful. And through it all, the amount of people that we had praying for us all over the world, just reaching out to us with just, we care. Sometimes it's just so important to know people care and that you're not alone. There's many times when you feel like you're alone. I mean, when you're in that kind of situation, you can't always go. I mean, for years, my husband and I would take turn going to churches. For years, he would go to church, I would go to church. We took turns going to special occasions. He would stay home, I would stay home next time. So our family was quite often divided. And I'll stay home with Luke and Lily. You go, and just and I mean, that's kind of that happens in normal circumstances. But it was a challenge at times. I don't know if you've ever heard this, but 80% of all marriages fell after a tragic accident of a child, drowning especially. And praise God, I'm still married 42 years, almost 42 years. So I could just share with you so many of the miracles of God through that whole journey of just him carrying us, giving us strength, financially providing his work. Gordy has worked for REI now for 35 years. And REI was so good to him. They gave him 6 weeks off paid. He didn't have that much time. When Luke was in the hospital, he didn't have to work at all for that 4 weeks. And then he at that time was a manager, and they let him go back to being a good old techie. He works on computers in the IT department there, and they were so good to him to give him back that job and didn't get a pay cut, which was just amazing. So God's provision with people helping and caring. Caring is so important when you're going through something like that.
Yeah. So I would imagine with the drowning and then all that following care that was needed, there would be a lot of seasons of grief. Like you said, you had a pity party. How did you kind of shift that dark feeling?
And I think the blame, when you have a child that drowns in your backyard pool, I mean, it was my fault, and it was, of course, not my fault, but it took years before the Lord just released me from that. And just because it was a above ground pool, and my husband had said, let's take it down. And I said, no, it's still warm in September. Let's keep it up for 2 more weeks. And, so therefore, in my mind, it was my fault. I'm the one. If I had just taken down that pool, it never would have happened, and all the things that you go through. So the guilt and the
I'm trying to envision above ground pool. He climbed up a ladder
He did.
To get into that pool.
Yeah. Yeah.
Even that, why did God allow him to have the attention span to climb up and get into that pool?
Yeah. So many little details that, and anybody you talk to that goes through a tragedy, their child goes through something like this horrible, or an accident, or, kids that are ran over, or, there's so many sad stories out there, and you hear them all when you're a part of this world. And I don't know. You can why God to death sometimes. Why God? Why? And I remember there was just times when I don't like to cry in front of people. I do a little bit more now. I mean, I cry in front of people a little bit more now. For a long time, I would just get in my shower and I would just sob. And it took a long time before I even wanted to see people or be around people. I always say my personality changed for a while. You made the comment today when you saw me. Oh, you got your, I don't know.
Accessories. You look so cute.
Earrings and necklaces.
Yeah.
And I went through a stage where I didn't care. I didn't wear earrings. I just didn't care about my appearance. I was just, it was the I don't care state, because it was just, every day was hard. And thankfully, I never lost my faith. I always say the year before I got pregnant with Luke, I went through a horrible miscarriage where I almost died. And I was 16 weeks. I lost the baby, and I almost walked away from my faith. I've known Jesus since I was 6. I've always been a very strong believer, but that rocked me to my core. I often say that was the training ground of my faith being tried immensely before Luke's accident. And so I never walked away from God. I never completely turned my eyes away from him. I mean, there was a lot of whys, and you could have stopped this, and why didn't you heal him? And those are not always productive, of course. I mean, we know that, but they're human. We're human.
Yeah.
We're human. So so we walked that road for many years, and like I said, life didn't stop. We took Luke on a 7-week vacation across America. Went to 32 states.
Oh, my goodness.
It was a lot of work.
Now, wait, how old is Luke at this point?
When he was 18 years old.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, and he's still 24/7.
Yeah.
He's in a wheelchair. We're changing his diaper. He doesn't feed himself. He doesn't do anything for himself.
Wow.
So it was a lot of work. But my husband, since he'd been working at REI for so long, he gets a sabbatical. And he had a sabbatical. So we took this big, giant trip across the country.
And how many of your kids were able to go with you?
We saw all of them. It was just the 4. It was our last 4, Isaiah, Ezekiel, Luke, and Lily. Okay. Ezekiel had graduated from a Christian college in Pennsylvania. So we all drove to Pennsylvania, watched him graduate. And then from there we took off and we went actually to the very tip of Maine. And then we drove all the way down the East Coast not to the tip of Florida, but to Florida. And then from Florida, we came back home. And then along the way, Our daughter, who lives in Missouri, and her 4 kids and husband met us in South Carolina for a week. And then we spent the week in Florida with our daughter, Amy, and her husband, Lance, and their 3 kids at our church convention. And then we met our son and his wife and their 4 kids in Yellowstone for our last 3 days of our vacation. So we got to spend time with all of our children, just not all together.
Yeah, because your oldest have started families.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
My oldest 3 all have children. Well, now 4 of them have children. So I have going on 12 grandchildren soon.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah.
Wow.
And, that was the thing about Luke. Luke loved his nieces and nephews. We would always put him in, he would sit in a wheelchair and, put him in his lap, and he would just get the biggest smile. So, we always included Luke. He was always a part of our family. We took him everywhere we could. We never excluded him. He, if we were on vacation, I think there was only once or twice we didn't take him. Of all the years, he went with us camping, carrying him into the trailer, and so we just included him. And then 2 years ago next week, actually, he passed. And it was such a surprise because we had just gotten home from a trip. We all went down to California for a Foursquare Church convention. And then from California, my husband headed home with our daughter and son. And then my son, Isaiah, and I and Luke all went from California to the Grand Canyon. We took him to the Grand Canyon, and then we went from there to Four Corners. We went to Mesa Verde, and then we went to Missouri to visit my daughter, and then we went to South Dakota to visit my son. And because we were going to spend an extra week away from home because they remodeled his room, and his room needed it. He had carpet in there, and we got new flooring, and we painted it, and we did all this electrical work. And we got home, and it was so amazing because over the years, Luke would get sick. And our rule was if he was sick longer than 24 hours, we would take him in. But he would just get sick every once in a while, And he got really sick on Friday. And it kind of started a little bit on Thursday night. Friday, he was sick. And Saturday, I was like, if he's not better, we're going to take him to urgent care. And Friday night was a nightmare. And he would just have an hard time breathing. And so we prayed, and we just felt like we wanted Jesus to do a miracle. We didn't want to take him into the hospital again. And that was a hard decision. We called all our kids, and the ones that could come over quickly came. And my daughter in Missouri, we called her, and we told her, and she got on a plane. She found out at 9 o'clock in the morning, and she was at our house by 6. She got to talk to Luke, and 3 minutes later, he was gone. I know he waited for Natalie. And that was 2 years ago, next week. And so this is kind of a raw time for me, even to be talking about this. It's like,
grief has got to take years and years, and you had a different kind of grief raising Luke.
Yes, there's a name for it. I can't remember, but there's a name for that kind of grief where you grieve the child that even though they lived, they will never have the life that they were supposed to have. You grieve all the milestones. Oh, they should go to kindergarten. They should be in high school. They should get their license.
Graduated.
There's so many milestones that because they're still there. And they're part of everything, and yet you grieve what they're not, So, so that was crazy. And yet I tell people all the time, my miracle is I still believe in miracles. And even though we prayed for not every single solitary day, but many, many, many days, God, we always prayed that God would heal him, that he would walk and talk, and we believed it. We believed it because that's the kind of God we serve. We serve a God that can do miracles. And once he passed, it was like, I went through a bit of a crisis a little bit, just like, why? And yet I could see God's loving hand in the fact that we had taken that trip. So he got to spend that time in California because my daughter and her family were in the house with us. We stayed in a big Airbnb in California. And so Lily and Amy and, just their families were all there in that house. And then we stopped, like I said, in Missouri to see my daughter and her family, and they got to spend a couple days with him. And then we stopped to see Daniel and Sarah, and they got to spend a couple days with him. And then he was gone a few days later. And so it was just like, even in that, God's goodness of letting all my children spend just a little time with him the week before he died was, I consider, a miracle, I had no clue that was going to happen, but God did.
You and your husband can kind of work through your struggle with Luke not being healed. Do you worry about your kids at all with that journey of praying for healing?
I remember saying to Jesus, and this was a hard prayer, but more than anything in the world, even more than Luke being healed, I want all my kids to be in heaven now. My daughter, Amy, who found him in the bottom of the pool, both him and my son did CPR on him. She had horrible nightmares. She went to a conference, a youth conference, a Christian youth conference. And at that conference, a man was sharing how he found his best friend dead in a river, drowned. And afterwards, she went up and asked for prayer, and God delivered her. And she has never had a nightmare again. And my kids, even though you can try your best, when you have a child that's so medically fragile, and I don't know how many nights I spent in the hospital, because when Lou was in the hospital, he was never left alone, ever. Either I was there or my husband was there, and sometimes my sister Cindy would come for an hour, just give us a break. My other kids probably were a bit neglected at times, which breaks my heart. And it's just, I consider it a miracle that all my children love Jesus, because I know many families that their kids turn to drugs or alcohol, or they drown from the sorrow, because it's just sorrow. It's constant sorrow. Through everything, we have to keep trusting and knowing that He's got plans and purposes that we can't fathom. We can't understand them. We can't even begin to know. I know there's nothing impossible with God.
Yeah.
We either believe that or we don't, and we don't give up. I just thank the Lord that I haven't lost that hope or that faith of just believing that He could still do miracles, even though my son didn't get his miracle, And he's in heaven, and I think he's so happy. He's talking, he's walking. I often think, he's probably got so many words that were stored up. He probably talked Jesus' ear off, or anybody that would listen to him.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah. I honestly believe we're all called to go through hard seasons and hard things, and yet with God's help, we can do all things through Christ who strengthens us.